Evaluation of the success of marine protected areas in the Bahamas. As humans become increasingly aware of the deteriorating state of the Earth's natural environments, we have seen a growing appreciation for conservation efforts, particularly the use of protected areas. While much of the time protected areas are implemented with the primary goal of protecting biodiversity, either on land or in the ocean, there are many different uses of protected areas, such as tools for management fisheries and conserving traditional land and cultures. However, the success of protected areas is dependent on the strength of management and governance frameworks, which incorporate interdisciplinary, participatory, and contextual approaches. The Bahamas are an archipelagic nation made up of many islands and cays in the Caribbean Sea. The total human population in the Bahamas is just over 391,000, with most of these people concentrated on the urbanized island New Providence. In this region, the economy is largely dependent on tourism, which accounts for 75 to 80% of the GDP and employs half of the nation's labor force. Unlike New Providence, the remaining inhabitants are scattered on the surrounding islands in small traditional community groups. Some of these smaller community groups also rely on tourism and commercial fishing to support their livelihoods, while others are self-sufficient, depending on each other and the natural resources of the land and sea to meet their subsistence needs. In these self-sufficient communities, cash flow is often limited, and instead bartering and sharing goods and services with neighbours forms the foundations of their livelihoods. Since 1999, the Bahamian government and associated environmental agencies such as the Bahamas National Trust have worked together with international NGOs to develop a network of marine protected areas across the entire archipelago. Together they aim to conserve 20% of the nearshore environment by 2020, with the primary goal of fisheries replenishment and sustainable use of marine resources. However, achieving this goal has proved to be a complex task, as much of the planning and implementation of MPAs has focused on ecological aspects and largely failed to address important social aspects, such as the context of traditional communities and engagement with the local stakeholders. Historically, protected areas around the world followed what the IUCN refers to as governance by government. In this system, all authority, responsibility, and accountability of the protected area is held by a government ministry or agency which reports directly to the government. For example, in the Bahamas, marine protected areas within the region are governed by the Bahamas National Trust. This regime of centralized power is often perceived as very efficient in that MPAs are designed and managed by well-educated and trained specialists in the field and then enforced with laws and policies. However, in smaller nations where traditional communities have strong ties with marine resources, there has been an emphasis in resource user participation and the decentralization of governance through co-governance. Social studies carried out within the traditional communities of the Bahamas have shown that most of the communities would support local MPAs. However, this is on the basis that they could participate in the design and management of the MPA. Additionally, many locals believe that these agencies are less strict on upper-class citizens and can be bribed with money to allow developments within the MPAs. This has caused a lack of trust in current governance to manage and enforce MPAs. Due to the previous failure to involve the communities in the management of MPAs and the consequential failure to implement said MPAs, this has now invoked negative responses and a lack of support for newly proposed MPAs. Another reason that the proposed MPAs have been difficult to finalize in the Bahamas is because the initial impact assessments considered the ecological aspects, but they did not carry out a thorough social impact assessment. Scientists instead used 3 socio-economic criteria to determine how the MPA network would affect communities, each of which failed to effectively assess the social impacts at local scales. Firstly, they assessed the commercial fishing impact by determining the level of displacement of current fishing activities and the potential for short-term alternative livelihoods. While this was an option in communities which were cash-based and could switch to tourism to compensate for the loss of commercial fishing, it failed to address more traditional communities with informal economies. The restriction of subsistent fishing grounds, which were used in daily routines, threatened their traditional way of living and social structures by removing the foundation of their relationships. Secondly, they assessed the support for MPAs if communities were involved in the development and supervision of the reserves. As mentioned earlier, studies have previously demonstrated this high level of support. However, the Bahamian government and conservation agencies have largely failed to yet enable participation in the planning stage, not to mention the management and supervision of MPAs, which has created resistance towards proposed MPAs. The final socio-economic criteria used in the initial planning was community benefits. Again, economic benefits because of increased tourism and more stable fishing stocks invoked support from communities which had adapted these industries into their livelihoods. However, nations which are more reliant on fishing are less likely to support the reserves, as the benefits of tourism and commercial fisheries are currently not applicable to them. Consequently, they would bear the costs of the MPAs but not receive any benefits. If the initial planning phase had communicated more effectively with the communities on the smaller islands and considered these social aspects before proposing a new reserve, many of the resistance now faced by communities could have been avoided. This case study shows that to successfully implement protected areas in regions of the world where locals are closely linked with natural resources, approaching conservation from not only a biological perception but also a social stance is necessary. Understanding the context of local groups is important to understand how conservation costs and benefits will be applied. It is also important to realize that a decentralized governance regime and higher community participation encourages support, making the implementation process much simpler and increasing the success of protected areas.